Good afternoon and welcome to this screening of Race, the Power of an Illusion, Episode 3, presented by the UC Davis Campus Community Book Project. My name is Megan Macklin and I serve as a program manager in the Office of Campus Community Relations where I manage the book project. Thank you for joining. While we meet today in a virtual space, we'd like to begin by reading the following statement that acknowledges the land where UC Davis sits. We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Quechua-Dihi Band of Wintun Nations of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and Yochudiehi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. To begin, a couple of housekeeping items for our virtual event. Captions can be accessed by clicking the live transcript button in your Zoom window. There you can show or hide subtitles and access a full transcript. The introduction and discussion portions of today's event are being recorded and the recording will be made available on the book project website. When we turn to discussion, we encourage you to turn on your video. It's great, especially for our facilitators to see faces. And you are invited to ask questions or share comments in the chat at any point during the event. The UC Davis Campus Community Book Project promotes dialogue and builds community by encouraging diverse members of the campus and surrounding communities to read the same book and attend related events. The Book Project, a signature initiative out of the Office of Campus Community Relations since 2002, advances the mission to improve both the campus climate and community relations, to foster diversity, and to promote equity and inclusiveness. Currently in its 20th year, the Book Project in 2021-2022 focuses on the theme of social justice in practice and features How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Our theme and selection are supported by a year-long program of lectures, workshops, book discussions, film screenings, exhibits, performances, and more. Our program culminates later this month when author Ibram X. Kendi comes to UC Davis on Thursday, March 31st to speak at the Mondavi Center for the Performing Arts. For more information about the Book Project program, visit our website where you can find up-to-date event information, registration links, and other resources. We also welcome your involvement, students, staff, faculty, and community members, in selecting the Book Project featured title and in planning our annual program. If you're interested in getting involved with the Book Project, please send us an email or refer to the Book Project website for more information. The film we will watch today, Race, the Power of an Illusion, is available for on-demand screening to UC Davis affiliates via the University Library VPN. The Book Project also hosted virtual screenings and discussions of episodes 1 and 2 earlier in the academic year, and we recorded the introduction and discussion components of those events. Please refer to the links in chat for more information. And now let's turn to our film. So as we transition to discussion of the film, I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Christopher and Tom, who will facilitate our session. Christopher Nguyen-Finnegar is a diversity and inclusion educator and specialist in the Office of Campus Community Relations, where he develops and facilitates educational and professional development around DEI topics for diverse audiences from various academic and administrative departments across UC Davis and UC Davis Health. He also assists in the development and implementation of strategies to operationalize the UC Davis Principles of Community and the UC Davis Diversity and Inclusion Strategic Vision. Thomas O'Donnell is an analyst in the Office of Academic Diversity, where he initially began working as a graduate student researcher. Tom primarily works on faculty recruitment and retention initiatives and on efforts by the campus to achieve its Hispanic Serving Institution designation. He graduated from UC Davis with a PhD in history, where he studied US working women and urban development in the early 20th century. Christopher and Tom, take it away.
All right, thank
you, Megan.
Go ahead, Tom. Uh-oh, this is the part where we're like, who talks first, who jumps in? Well, I'll just keep, I think I'll share some initial reactions and I'll try to keep them short. But really, I think with this film, what really comes up for me is just you're seeing how race is actually constructed. And you're seeing how we organize society within the United States around race. And so you get to this notion of like racial constructs, right? And you see how law and policy are working to sort of inform how we might understand race. They inform how we might understand how we view an Asian American or an African American or Black person. And I think they create it sort of. It's like the legal structures within the United States are what are contributing to this notion, this idea of race. And I think the video, the documentary, this episode gets to that really, really well. So I'll leave my comments short for that at that for now. Tom, what's coming up for you?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this particular episode was kind of a two-parter. The second half, which presumably is what the subtitle, "The House We Live In," was based on, seemed kind of to break away from the first half, which seemed to kind of reiterate some of the history lessons from the first two episodes. It is a very heavy and important way, I think, to end this series. I mean, because you'd have to just be willfully unwillful to not understand and see, even today, the consequences of what this film was discussing. One of the very best books I read in graduate school here at UC Davis was Ira Katznelson's "When Affirmative Action Was White," which is largely covered this idea, in particular of the housing, and in not just the GI Bill's relationship to home loans and of the cascading long-term consequences of who had access to home loans, but the GI Bill's access to college education, right, to tuition. Like that as well is, to me, or it struck me as equally as important in the long-term consequences of building wealth that access to housing has. That that the number of non-whites that were eligible to enter college through the GI Bill was also very much to the disadvantage of non-whites. So it's a very heavy way to end it. That's still, for me, kind of aware of, beyond the housing, it's still very shaking.
Yeah, and I think how integrated housing becomes when you think about the way that different systems are interconnected in the United States. So if you have disparities amongst communities, right? You have like a predominantly white community over here, and then you have a predominantly Black community over here. And as the video was sharing, the differences and the disparities in housing and home values, right? Well, how does that impact everything else? Because if you think about it, what are our local school area taxes funded by, right? They're funded by like community property values, or at least they used to be. And in the sense that, like, we've changed a lot of the local funding formulas. But for the longest time, like, how much money your local school received was based on the property value of the home. So if you have, neighborhoods predominantly Black or POC folks that are in lower valued areas, and their school systems are then negatively impacted by that you can start to see how that trickles down, and I hate to use such a loaded term, but trickles down into like other aspects of an individual's life and an individual's sort of opportunities. One other thing that I want to share is that we in the Davis and Sacramento area are not immune to a lot of these policies. So in the chat, I actually shared a really good clip that my colleague Eric and I like to share in one of our diversity education sessions around housing policies within the Sacramento area. And it really goes in very nicely into sort of the differences between East Sacramento and the Fab 40s area, and then the impact of redlining through South Sacramento. And you can start to see some of the legacies there if you're familiar with the Sacramento area. But with that, let me actually open it up to folks, and I'll start with this question to the audience, which is, I'm really curious, what is something that you learned from this video or even the previous two videos that you didn't know before? And feel free to just unmute your mic and jump on in there. Seeing in the chat how deeply the systemic racism went.
One thing for me that was new was where colorblindness came from. This speech of Martin Luther King's, I never attached that to the concept of I don't see color. So that was new today.
Okay. What else has come up for folks, perhaps? Yeah, the accumulation of wealth over time. Redlining, okay.
I'll jump in. I had known a little bit more about housing policies. Actually, the first part of the film with the citizenship and the different court cases, that was really new to me. And just, it helped me frame how much of a construct, you know, particularly the one where in one case, oh, we're scientifically, this person is not white. And then in a case a couple of months later, oh no, actually it has nothing to do with science. So how it was selective. And even in the name of science, law, and policy.
Yeah, and I think there's a real contradiction there because I think in the last 50 or 60 years, we have sort of seen the United States Supreme Court as like this beacon, right, that of justice. But I would say that if you ask any political scientist out there, they'll say that the United States Supreme Court is just as political as the other two branches of our government, right? And then sort of the arbitrariness of, you know, who is and is not white, which I think contributes to the difficulty around conversations about whiteness, like what is whiteness, right? It's almost what's the word I'm looking for? Not tangible, right? It's difficult to like grab a hold of. What else is coming up for folks? Thoughts, questions, ideas?
Okay. I was in a study group this summer around the book, The Color of Law, where a lot of these same issues came up. And I did not know how much of this was actually codified into law. I just always, when I was in high school, I'm 67. When I was in high school, we were taught that it was de facto problems. You know, de facto segregation and de facto discrimination, not anything coming out of policy. And especially out of that book, The Color of Law, there was a lot of very local, I mean, Northern California, where I grew up, that, you know, that this redlining and was actually caused by government. I didn't know that before.
Yeah, and, another book that I would recommend if these topics of today's that interest you is one by Kevin Kruse, who is a really fabulous, accessible historian. And although not recently, he was quite active on Twitter and liked to get into brawls with conservative, unhinged voices on Twitter. But this book, White Flight, is one of kind of the foundational books in history that looks at how this concept of white flight that was talked about in the video, how it played out in Atlanta, in depth, is kind of like a micro history of it. And, you know, again, not just what this film kind of focused on, they had the time to the wealth accumulation, but everything, you know, what Christopher was suggesting about its relationship to schools, community services, you know, everything that, you know, goes into supporting a neighborhood, is also a really excellent, accessible book to check out as well.
So I think and I think it was Deborah that just shared this too. The idea around like de facto versus like de jure. And someone correct me if I'm mispronouncing that. I think it's de jure, right? Of law versus like of fact, segregation. And so really, I think what that is speaking to is the legacy of the long-standing impact of de jure segregation, of the long-standing impact of the that legal segregation had, and how that segregation, I think, might influence our individual perceptions, and influence the ways that we might or might not understand racial difference, and or navigate those racial differences, right? One thing that, and this video doesn't really talk about it, but I would encourage folks to look into it, is and they talk about sort of the Asian American experience, right? And how the history of Asian American immigration, which you can think of in sort of like three different points throughout history, three different waves throughout history. But really thinking about how you have Blacks, people, and African Americans sort of racially constructed in one way, and you have white people sort of racially constructed in another, and then in the middle here you get Asian Americans, and I mean, I say that specifically as like a sort of an aggregate Asian American experience, but really how Asian Americans become racialized for the convenience of maintaining sort of this sense of segregation. And the video kind of touches about it. It implies it, right? Because the video, I think, at one point talks about sort of the economic status of Black and African Americans, the economic status of like white folks, and then sort of the varying economic status of like everyone else in between. So if you think about like the Asian model, the model minority myth, and like Asians are good at math, and our Asian American families value education, which is silly because I think most people value education, and so how that is used as a wedge between like white and Black communities. So I think if folks wanted to sort of continue on this journey of learning, I would encourage them to really look into some of the history around the ways that Asian Americans have been racialized, look into some of the origins around the model minority myth. And I think that would deepen a lot of, or really just enrich everything else that this video has talked about. What else comes up for folks, or questions that folks might have?
Do you have a recommendation for looking into the Asian model minority myth in terms of book articles, anything like that?
So let me look that up. Yes, I have like a whole file of things somewhere. But the other thing is also just Googling like model minority myth, and see where that leads you.
Yeah, no, I've done some. I just wondered kind of what comes top of mind to you. Thank you.
Allison, that I think is a great question, one that I'm actively searching an answer for. I what and Tom, if you have thoughts about this, let me know too. But I think what comes up for me sort of just immediately is addressing fear. I think addressing the fear that people have as a result of misinformation. So, for example, the active resistance to teachers the history, and I think the resistance against critical race theory, which is funny because the K through 12 system doesn't teach critical race theory, and not only that, critical race theory is not something you would teach to elementary school children. It's something that you would teach to educators, and then they would apply critical race theory in their practice as teachers. So that's the first misunderstanding, right? And then just sort of the misinformation around, we're teaching critical race theory. Where if we're teaching about this history, then white folks are going to lose out and they're going to be disenfranchised, right? And there's nothing scarier than a scared human being. And I think that what you see right now are people who are responding out of fear because of that misinformation. So I would say that maybe one of the first things that we need to do is figure out how to reach people and acknowledge the fear, and then maybe say, this is actually the reality of what's going on. This is the reality of I think the topic of the conversations that we need to have. And you have an investment in this conversation just as much as everyone else, just as much as any person of color, and so on and so forth, because the systems that we're talking about, whether it's in housing or education or the justice system, have just as much an impact on people who identify as white or straight or cisgender or heterosexual as they do on anybody else in our community. I had another thought and it left me. But Tom, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
Well, I think certainly for me, my approach has always been just to try to, I think what Christopher's saying is just influence and educate myself and influence those closest around me. I mean, I'm not a leader of many things, if anything, even my own family at times it seems. And so participating for me in events like this, going to events like this to educate myself, I have a PhD in this stuff, but I'm still constantly searching out discussions or opportunities to learn more, to learn from people, to read or to watch or to engage in conversations with the people around me. In my life, that's probably the best that I can do right now. I think to a certain extent, the controversy around what, is, as Christopher says, critical race theory to me is just teaching history. Is, to me, I take it a little bit of comfort in. To me, it's a sign of the success of the teaching of history that's going on, that people are becoming more conscious about the de facto racism, sexism in our society, and pushing it back against some of these formal structures that could operate, supposedly colorblind, sex blind, equal bootstrap meritocracy discourse that is being attacked and questioned now is a consequence of a growing critical mass of people disputing the meritocracy of our system, or the supposed colorblindness of it. And as I think that's, to me, what Christopher is also talking about, the reaction of the fear that people have, that to me is a sign that there's some headway being made, not all at once. Perhaps we saw in the civil rights movement, which as that sociologist Dalton, I believe, pointed out, despite all of that, the differences in net worths are horrifying. That we could start to kind of push against that as an individual. That's the best that I can do, to be honest, at this point.
Hmm. That is an excellent question. So ethnic studies in high schools, and even if you look at the community college system, there's an expansion of ethnic studies programs throughout the community college system, throughout the high school system in California. And I think it does very much what this video is doing. It raises issues around some of the history that we haven't taught, right? So teaching the history of the Asian American experience, teaching the history of the Black experience, the Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, Latine experience in California and the United States, teaching those histories. And so I didn't get the opportunity to have like an ethnic studies program in my high school when I was in high school, but I did have an AP US history teacher who taught us Howard Zinn, his textbook, on the people's history of the United States. And that was sort of like my first exposure to this. And that was a great textbook because it really sort of flipped everything on its head in terms of the history that I had been taught before that. And all of that is to say that for me, that AP US history course and that textbook was really just very eye-opening, and really, very transformational for me. So I think that ethnic studies programs are expanding. I think there's been movement in the state legislature amongst different caucuses affiliated with I know specifically like the Caucus for Asian and Pacific Americans within the California state legislature have hosted like meetings around the expansion of ethnic studies and Asian American studies. So I think there's a lot of movement and growth there, and I think it's going to go in that direction. And this was just before sort of this panicked response against critical race theory. So it'll be interesting to see where things go, but all that's to say that I think ethnic studies can do a lot of good in terms of really sharing this knowledge and history. And one last thing I'll say adjacent to that is really the students that are in elementary, middle, and high school now, and the students that are entering college now, who are have access to knowledge and resources in the ways that I think a lot of us didn't as we were growing up, they're going to change the world. Those folks are the ones that are they're just absorbing all this history that I think, and the other thing about that too is the more that people try to hide the history from them, the more they're going to want to seek that out. Because as a young person, I can tell you, if you told me not to do it, I definitely would do it. But unless anyone else has questions, or unless Tom, you have any other last thoughts, I think we'll hand it back to Megan.
Take it away, Megan. Thank you for hosting, Megan.
Thank you, Christopher and Tom, for another really fascinating discussion. Thanks to our audience for joining. Hope that you enjoyed today's film. And if you had an opportunity to view episodes 1 and 2 and join us for those discussions, thank you for sticking with us. As mentioned earlier, the film is available online for UC Davis affiliates through the University Library. So to close things out, I want to give an invitation to this group. We welcome your feedback on today's event. We've put together a post-event survey, which you can access via the QR code that you see on your screen, and also the URL that's there. As a thank you for your participation in the post-event survey, we are raffling off a ticket to see Ibram X. Kendi on March 31st. I just checked earlier this afternoon to see where ticket sales are at for that, and I think they're about 10 tickets away from selling out. So filling out this survey might be your way in to see Ibram X. Kendi on March 31st. Thank you again to everyone for participating. The book project will return in spring quarter, again with Ibram X. Kendi's event on March 31st, and then we'll have a couple of programs into April as well. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon, everyone.